It was a September day in 1918. America thundered under the weight of the First World War, while its streets were heavy with anxiety, loss, and mourning. Amid this chaos, in the home of the influential Kennedy family, a baby girl was born. They named her Rosemary. The world did not welcome her gently. Alongside the war, a ruthless influenza epidemic, later known as the Spanish flu, was ravaging the country, claiming thousands of lives. Yet for Joseph and Rose Kennedy, the birth of their third child and first daughter was a ray of hope in a dark time. They dreamed that she would one day become the jewel of the dynasty, an American princess worthy of the Kennedy name. But from her very first moments, Rosemary's life was marked by tragedy. When labor began, the doctor could not arrive in time. Hospitals were overwhelmed, doctors exhausted from battling the epidemic. In desperation, a nurse made a fateful decision. She forced the mother to hold the baby inside until the doctor arrived. For 2 long and agonizing hours, Rosemary's tiny head remained trapped in the birth canal, deprived of oxygen. This devastating delay would become the first chapter of a lifelong ordeal. At first glance, it seemed that Rosemary had survived unharmed. She was brought home to a loving but intensely disciplined household where perfection was demanded. The Kennedys raised champions, future senators and presidents. In this family, there was no room for weakness. That was simply the way things were. But soon, it became clear that something was wrong. Rosemary lagged behind her brothers and sisters. Her movements were clumsy, her speech was slow, and her emotions unpredictable. The family did everything they could to hide these struggles from the public eye. For the Kennedys, this was not just fear, it was a threat to the very foundation of their public image. Their children were supposed to embody the American dream, not serve as reminders that even wealth and power could not always conquer fate. By the time Rosemary turned 22, her father, the powerful and ambitious Joseph Kennedy, made a horrifying decision, insisting it was for her own good. Under the pretense of treating her intellectual difficulties, he agreed to an experimental procedure of the time, lobotomy. This brutal operation was intended to calm her episodes of anger and anxiety. But instead of bringing relief, the lobotomy destroyed Rosemary. After the operation, she was left severely impaired, barely able to speak, with limited movement and no independence. From that moment on, the family almost entirely hid her away from public view. Rosemary became a secret, locked behind the grand facades of the Kennedy estates. Years later, as her brothers rose to the pinnacles of power, John became president, Robert and Ted became senators. Rosemary remained in the shadows, nearly forgotten by society. Yet her story cast a dark shadow over the glittering image of the American dynasty, a haunting reminder of the price sometimes paid to maintain the illusion of perfection. The Kennedy home always sparkled with life. Lively family dinners, bursts of laughter, and sharp-witted jokes tossed back and forth between brothers like tennis balls across a court. Everything about their world seemed tailor-made for the image of the perfect American family. But at the very center of this vibrant whirlwind sat a young girl whose quiet presence stood out more sharply than any words ever could. Her name was Rosemary. When Rosemary was born, her parents dreamed of her future just as they did for all their children. But soon, an uneasy worry began to creep into their hearts. Months passed, and Rosemary struggled to reach even the most basic milestones. By the time she was 2 years old, she could barely crawl. A primal, suffocating fear took root in a family that was accustomed to controlling every aspect of their carefully curated lives. The Kennedys pursued perfection with relentless ambition. There was no room for flaws. Yet Rosemary simply did not fit into their meticulously constructed portrait of excellence. Instead of acknowledging her challenges openly and seeking help, they hid her from public view, behind the closed doors of private schools, in the shadows of elegant family gatherings, concealed beneath smiles and the polished facade of an ideal life. Meanwhile, the family continued to grow. Child after child filled the house with voices and debates. But at the table, amid the clever remarks and lively exchanges, Rosemary remained silent, as though her thoughts drifted somewhere far beyond the room. Her mother often spoke of her with tender affection, She always tried so hard. She cherished any attention, any compliment. She simply wanted to be loved. Indeed, Rosemary possessed a gentleness and a quiet grace that set her apart from her ambitious siblings. But there was something else about her that stirred a deep, almost panicked fear in her parents. Rosemary was blossoming. Though she lacked the natural sharpness and confidence of the Kennedys, she had inherited their striking Irish beauty. As she entered her teenage years, her appearance began to draw attention, a prospect that unsettled her parents far more than her academic struggles ever had. They did everything they could to mask her imperfections. Private tutors worked tirelessly to teach Rosemary how to read and write, but progress came painfully slow. When she turned 15, her parents enrolled her in the Sacred Heart Convent School in Rhode Island, hoping that, hidden away from prying eyes, the nuns might help her build confidence. She was taught in isolation, kept apart from other students, as if the family feared the world might discover her weaknesses. Yet keeping Rosemary hidden was far from simple. In the year 1938, the Kennedys made another bold move. Joseph Kennedy, the family patriarch, received his appointment as the United States ambassador to the United Kingdom. The family relocated to London, closer to the epicenter of world politics and, perhaps more importantly, further away from American gossip. And so, with her family, Rosemary stepped into a new chapter of this complex and haunting family saga. In the early 1940s, the Kennedy family had firmly secured their place at the top of American society. Fame, influence, and public admiration surrounded their everyday lives. At this moment of triumph, Rose and Joseph Kennedy made a crucial decision. Their daughter Rosemary would be presented to the British royal couple, King George VI and Queen Elizabeth. This was to be Rosemary's official debut into high society. For Rosemary, who could barely read and write at a fourth-grade level, the occasion was not only an honor but also a terrifying ordeal. Royal etiquette was a demanding art. Even the simple act of greeting the monarchs required flawless posture, precise movements, and a perfectly executed curtsy. Knowing that her parents expected nothing short of perfection, Rosemary entered the hall filled with tension. For a brief moment, fate played a cruel trick. She stumbled and nearly fell at the feet of the king and queen. The royal couple pretended not to notice, but inside, Rosemary was overwhelmed by a mixture of anxiety and relief. A year later, Rosemary traveled with her family to Rome to witness the coronation of Pope Pius XII. Soon after, there was a visit to the White House. Her debutante status was now officially recognized. In the eyes of high society, she was a young lady from a powerful family, surrounded by glamour, attention, and honor. But behind the glittering image was a darker reality. Magazines eagerly sought to feature her as the new jewel of the Kennedy clan. However, her parents were deeply afraid that any interview might accidentally expose what they worked so hard to conceal: Rosemary's mental challenges. They controlled every word released to the public, crafting stories about her supposed passion for teaching and a secret dream of becoming an actress. None of this reflected reality, but it helped preserve the carefully constructed illusion. By early 1940, the public saw Rosemary as a radiant and happy young woman. Yet, beneath the polished exterior, something troubling was unfolding. After returning from England, as her younger sister Eunice later recalled, Rosemary seemed to break. Her intellectual and emotional abilities began to deteriorate rapidly. Seizures soon followed, frightening convulsions that left the family both bewildered and terrified. But this was only the beginning. Her personality began to shift dramatically. Frequent outbursts of anger, aggressive confrontations, and at times even physical violence toward those closest to her. The family, obsessed with maintaining a perfect public image, now found themselves trapped by Rosemary's increasingly uncontrollable episodes. In desperation, her parents turned to old methods: removal and isolation. They sent her to a summer camp in Massachusetts, hoping that a change of environment might offer some relief. But those hopes were quickly dashed when Rosemary's behavior led to her expulsion. A new attempt at a boarding school in Philadelphia also failed after only a few months. Finally, having exhausted all other options, Joseph and Rose Kennedy resorted to a last measure. They placed Rosemary in a convent school, much like the one where she had spent her early childhood. But everything was different now. She was no longer a compliant little girl. Before them stood a grown woman, confused, suffering, and slipping further out of control, both emotionally and mentally. She tasted freedom for the first time, and had no intention of letting the nuns dictate her life ever again. But with that first breath of independence came trouble. Almost immediately, while the other novices spent their evenings in quiet prayer and chores, Rosemary was breaking the rules. At night, as the convent hallways slipped into shadow, she would sneak out beyond the gates. These secret escapes were an open rebellion, daring, dangerous, and completely unacceptable in the eyes of her strict mentors. No one knew for certain what Rosemary was doing out there, but the whispers were scandalous. Secret meetings with men, possible pregnancies. The very foundation of Catholic morality shook under the weight of such rumors. Her parents, especially her father, were terrified. Joseph Kennedy, the patriarch of the powerful family, viewed his daughter's behavior not just with parental concern, but with the cold, calculating eye of a politician. He saw a looming threat to everything he had built. His son's political careers, his daughter's social standing, the family's carefully cultivated image. One misstep from Rosemary could stain the Kennedy legacy forever. And to protect that legacy, he was willing to do the unthinkable. At the time, the world knew very little about mental illness. But there was a new medical procedure being promoted as a miracle cure: lobotomy. The surgery severed nerve connections in the brain's frontal lobe, supposedly calming anxiety and aggression by physically altering the brain's function. Joseph Kennedy believed this was exactly what his rebellious daughter needed. In November of 1941, at just 23 years old, Rosemary was brought into the operating room to face two surgeons, James Watts and Walter Freeman. The details of the operation remain chilling. As the surgeons slowly cut through her living brain tissue with scalpels and specialized tools, they forced Rosemary to recite prayers, sing patriotic songs, and count backwards. This allowed them to monitor how deeply they were cutting. They only stopped when her words became incoherent. When the procedure was finished, Rosemary was sent home. But it quickly became clear that something had gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. She had entered the surgery as a spirited, sometimes temperamental young woman. She emerged as a shadow of her former self. Her speech was almost unintelligible, her mind clouded and confused. Her mental abilities collapsed to the level of a small child, wiping away years of growth and development. But the nightmare didn't end there. With her mind broken, her body followed. Rosemary lost the ability to walk. Her muscles failed to obey. She became physically helpless, trapped inside a damaged brain, unable to care for herself in even the most basic ways. All of it for the sake of the family's reputation. As biographer Lawrence Leamer would later write, Joseph Kennedy had a habit of cutting off problems and moving on. With his own daughter, he did just that. But this time, the price for his ambition wasn't paid by America or politics. It was paid by his own blood. Sometimes, the hardest decisions in life are not made out of love, but out of fear. In the Kennedy family, fear was a constant companion. Fear of falling short, fear of disgrace, fear of imperfection. Alongside this fear was an unrelenting drive to maintain a flawless public image. And one day, that image came to include their daughter, Rosemary. Joseph Kennedy, the family patriarch, was a man whose ambitions were as vast as the ocean. For him, reputation was everything. So when it became clear that Rosemary did not fit the polished facade, with her emotional outbursts, mood swings, and growing instability, he made a choice that would forever alter her life. He acted in complete silence. Not even his wife, Rose, knew of his plan until it was too late. Lobotomy, a word that sounds like a sentence, was performed without her knowledge. But the procedure proved disastrous. What had once been a struggle became something irreversible. Every time Joseph and Rose looked at Rosemary's vacant face and distant gaze, it was as if they built an invisible wall around themselves. They did what they had always done best. They closed their eyes and pretended nothing had happened. Soon after, Rosemary was taken to a care facility, first in New York State and later in Wisconsin at the St. Coletta School for Children with Special Needs. Even there, her parents went to great lengths to hide her from public view. A separate building was constructed just for her, somewhat ironically nicknamed the Kennedy Cottage. Life there was far from free. Rosemary's world shrank to a handful of simple pleasures. 2 nuns cared for her, the young woman who once had dreams far beyond these walls. Occasionally, she was allowed to take a drive, walk a dog, or practice pottery under supervision. On the surface, it seemed peaceful, but in truth, it was quiet, endless isolation. The years went by. Throughout this time, there are almost no records of her parents visiting. Her mother did not see her for more than 20 years. Many of her siblings knew of her only through stories, and most never visited. Decades of solitude passed until a turning point arrived. In the year 1961, Joseph Kennedy's dream came true. His son, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, became President of the United States. Having finally achieved the power and status he had so long pursued, the patriarch felt ready to reveal part of the truth. He admitted that his daughter had long been living in an institution due to mental health issues. But, as always, Joseph only shared half the truth. The darkest part, the tragic lobotomy, remained hidden. Throughout his life, Joseph Kennedy concealed anything that could cast a shadow on his family's image. Even his confessions were incomplete, carefully edited versions of reality, leaving no room for pain or regret. Her fate seemed to have been written by someone else's hand, leaving her no room for protest, no hope for choice. Rosemary Kennedy, the eldest daughter of a dazzling dynasty, was born into a life meant to be filled with glittering balls, elegant dinners, and brilliant prospects. But behind the luxurious facades of the Kennedy home lurked darker shadows: ambition, fear, and a deep intolerance for weakness. In those days, society offered little forgiveness for anyone who was different. To be unlike others was to become a problem. Rosemary grew up a shy, sensitive child. Her mind was not lacking, but she lived in a constant struggle for recognition, for approval, for the love of her stern father, Joseph Kennedy. He dreamed of a family of flawless winners. But she, perhaps, simply suffered from depression, an illness barely understood at the time, let alone treated. In the early 1940s, Joseph made a monstrous decision. Swayed by medical advice, he agreed to a lobotomy for his daughter. The procedure was meant to calm her moods and curb her instability. Instead of relief, darkness followed. After the surgery, Rosemary almost stopped speaking. Her movements became stiff, her mind clouded. Her world shrank to the confines of hospital walls. Her father hid her away from everyone. Even her own siblings remained unaware of her fate for years. Only much later, in 1961, when Joseph himself was left nearly helpless after a stroke, did the veil of secrecy begin to lift. That same year, America celebrated the inauguration of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, another of Joseph's children, who had risen to the nation's highest office. The contrast was stark. While one child ascended to power, another languished in obscurity. After the patriarch's death in 1969, the remaining children finally began to visit Rosemary. And here, against all odds, her story took on a different hue. In the shadows of suffering, she did not break completely. Over the years, Rosemary fought back. Slowly and stubbornly, she relearned how to walk, though she limped. She learned to express her thoughts, despite her impaired speech. The life chosen for her by others could not fully extinguish her spirit. Even decades later, conflicting rumors surround her story. Was she truly mentally ill? Or was her only fault not fitting into her father's harsh expectations? One of the surgeons who performed the operation, James Watts, later admitted that he had not considered Rosemary intellectually disabled. Rather, she suffered from depression, which might have been treated very differently had she been born in another era. Before the operation, Rosemary kept diaries, filled with notes about balls, meetings, and conversations. Her letters to her father are heartbreaking. "Dearest Daddy, I love you so much." There is no trace of aggression or madness in her words, only the simple, tender love of a daughter for her parents. Her story might have faded into oblivion if not for one crucial legacy. Rosemary's younger sister, Eunice Kennedy Shriver, founded the Special Olympics in the 1960s, inspired by the lives of people like Rosemary. Though Eunice rarely spoke of it openly, everyone understood. Her sister was her symbol, a reminder of how cruel fate can be when the world refuses to accept those who are different. Rosemary outlived many in her family. She survived the deaths of her elder brothers, Joseph Jr. and John, the assassination of her younger brother Robert, and the tragic death of her sister Kathleen. Fate reserved a different cross for her. Not a sudden, tragic departure, but a slow, quiet existence, far from the storms that rocked the Kennedy household. She lived until 2005. She was 86 years old. In her final hours, her remaining siblings, Jean, Eunice, Patricia, and Ted, were at her side. Thus ended her long journey, marked by pain, yet filled with extraordinary resilience. The story of Rosemary Kennedy serves as a haunting reminder of the fragility of the human spirit and the heartbreak that can come when even family cannot embrace a loved one as they are.